Hello and welcome back to this talk on the Police Gazette by me, Richard Heaton. In part one, we had a look at what the Police Gazette was, the origins of the Police Gazette, how it developed over time, what you might find in terms of criminal ancestors in the Police Gazette, focusing particularly on descriptions from examples from the very early ones published in public newspapers, through to aliases, and then on to tattoos. In this part two, we'll be covering illustrations and advertisements, so finishing off the criminal identification section. We'll be looking at the armed forces, in particular deserters. We'll be having a look at where you might find original police gazettes. Then we'll move on to what you might find online, and wrapping up the UK Police Gazette, why your criminal ancestor doesn't appear, or doesn't appear to appear in the Police Gazette, if that makes sense. Finally, we'll move across and have a look at examples of the Irish Police Gazette, and then we'll touch very lightly upon Australia, New Zealand, and finish on a very elusive Police Gazette from India. Here we have some of the earliest, if not the earliest, portraits associated with the Police Gazette. These are woodcut engravings, and they've come from my collection. Most likely they were based on photographs, as they seem to be quite detailed. They were found on flyers inside police gazettes that had actually been sealed, and when I acquired them, I opened them up because I would need to scan them at some stage, and found these inside. They hadn't been touched from the 1880s. From left to right, we have Walter Carton, age 23. So in the middle, we've got William Wilson, age 25. They were both escapees from Borstal convict prison in 1881. And on the right-hand side, we've got a chap called Henry Douglas Keno, or Cone. And this came from a gazette dated the 2nd of April 1880. The actual flyer, which gives they all give descriptions as well as the portrait, isn't actually dated in this instance, but that was the date of the Gazette. He's aged 27, he's a merchant tailor, and he's wanted for arson. And these woodcuts came on very flimsy paper, so the survival rate must have been really, really small. And I can only imagine they were being distributed as there would be one copy in the Gazette for that to go up on a police notice board to aid in identifying wanted offenders. Now, the joy of any type of collecting, I guess, is that things can just get thrown about and turn up years later anywhere. When I was searching for further examples of images from the Police Gazette, I came across the Nova Scotia archive, images of which you can find on Flickr. And within that were examples of more of these very early portraits from these flyers that would have been inserted in the Police Gazette. It's not obvious when you've actually now only got the flyer, because it doesn't necessarily say Police Gazette on it, but all the other identification that's on the document matches up perfectly to the examples I've got. So I'm pretty certain this is the origin of these. On the left-hand side, we have John van der Steen, alias Henry Norris, Hamilton, Gordon, and Henrico Ricardo. So a good selection of aliases there. In the middle, these again from the same flyer as John van der Steen, we have Charles Lawrence, alias S.P. Clancy, Henry Fulton, brackets his real name, Henry Williams, and Lewis Henry Williams. Again, a good selection of aliases. And on another example, a separate example, we have a portrait of John Edward Ward. He's a lieutenant in the Army Hospital Corps, and he's wanted for embezzlement as well as desertion. And that example dates to the 17th of July 1884. And finally, to wrap up these early illustrations, I've got one example I wanted to share with you. This is a full page example. The only example of this size that I have got, and it's clearly, it says police notice, burglaries, special £10 reward. And I can imagine that being a wanted poster that would have been pasted up in police stations. There are two images, two faces if you like. And what we have on one side is a gentleman with a moustache and a beard. And on the other side, we've got, it's just the same gentleman, but clean shaven. So in this instance, they've tried to imagine, I guess, what the photograph might look like of the offender if he decides to clear all his facial hair off and use that as a means to become disguised or anonymous. Before we get into the other examples I wanted to share with you, I thought it might be worthwhile just looping back just around to, well, how were these made? The prints appearing in newspapers, and by this I guess I mean detailed prints, the realistic prints, have been around for quite some time. The Illustrated London News, for example, in 1848 has an amazing print of a Chartist meeting, and there's a similar photograph that exists that can be found on the web, and you can compare the two, and they've just been taken from slightly different angles. The perspectives are slightly different, but it's clearly the same meeting, and it has all feels like it's been taken from another photograph that we no longer have, but it's an amazing engraving. So how would you do it? Well, you'd do it probably via a wood block, and I've got an example here. It's the only woodblock example I have in my collection. This is from the 1860s, very early 1860, probably 1860, something like that, and it's of a Buckinghamshire tombstone, which is maybe appropriate for a family historian, and it was used as an illustration in Records of Buckinghamshire. It's really detailed. Obviously the wording on the tombstone has all had to be engraved in reverse, and if you look at the printed image that I've put up, I've got this from Google Books, you can see they've even gone to the trouble of an area that maybe was missing from this tombstone when it was found on a farm, and shaded that piece in, putting in the letters I think that they thought would have made up the missing words. I thought it might give you some kind of example of some reference point really to how these things have been constructed. They're not an easy thing to do, even from a photograph. And my best guess is because the Illustrated London News, for example, was a pretty big circulation newspaper, very popular, but there was an income coming in, so you could illustrate it, you could afford to do so, and that was obviously the clue is in the title of the paper in that instance. With the Police Gazette, this is a free paper, there's no money associated with it, it's government funding. So I can only guess that the reason the Police Gazette appears to lag so far behind We're talking, what, 30 plus years behind many of the other illustrated newspapers and magazines that were around, was because of the cost. And these flyers would have been probably relatively cheap to make as one-offs. Their survivability therefore would have been pretty low. And it's only when we actually start to get the Police Gazette format designed in a way whereby the images can actually be printed into the Gazette that we start to see these individuals, these offenders, in relatively large numbers. That brings us nicely to our first slide of a few images, portraits, if you like, of offenders wanted in the Police Gazette. There's a mixture. There's a few photographs I've popped in here. Most of them are engravings, probably done from photographs. And just one example here of how we start to explore photography as a medium. We've got a side-on view and a full frontal view in the top left. Others examples we come across are using mirrors, so that in one photograph we can get more than two views. And often if the individual has lost a finger or something like that, or part of a joint of a thumb, they may be being asked to hold up their hands in some of these photographs. Most of the portraits we see in the Police Gazette are for offenders, but there are a reasonable minority of portraits that are not of your criminal ancestors at all, but could be just your normal ancestor. These are individuals who went missing and who the police were trying to track down. I've put in just 5 examples here, including at the bottom Ellen Castle, who it says will most probably be found at some hotel, lodging or boarding house. I've also put in, just as an example, these seem to be very rare, a portrait, and it seems to be a very unusual portrait of a dog lost, which has got a £5 reward. And here we have some more examples from the Police Gazette, portraits. If we have a look, most of these again are quite detailed and would be of great use in identifying somebody. On the bottom left, I think we have another example where we've got a before and after shot with a beard and without a beard. Again, just trying to illustrate how somebody might attempt to disguise themselves very, very simply by just changing their facial appearance. The Gazette contains, a huge number of individuals. Most of them we wouldn't know unless they happen to be connected to our families in some way. But some of them are more infamous, I suppose. So we've got examples here, portraits of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen. Finally, I'll wrap up. In some cases, we don't have a portrait. So these are the advertisements for the Jack the Ripper murders that appeared in the Gazette. And despite what can appear elsewhere on the web, there are no portraits appearing in the UK Police Gazette of Jack the Ripper. That finishes my overview of crime in the Police Gazette. We now move on to records of the armed forces in the Police Gazette. And I've picked out an illustration here, again from the Georgian scrapbook, which I referred to earlier. And this is from 1801. It depicts a sailor, ex-sailor, and an ex-soldier, both pensioners. And the title a description of battles by sea and land in 2 volumes, which will be the sailor and the soldier, and they're in very animated conversation. You can see that the sailor has lost a leg and the soldier has lost an arm. But the main reason I chose this was because if we have a look, the date 1801, when these guys would have been in the Navy and in the Army, we're going back probably to around the birth time of the Police Gazette. So relatively relevant. They might well have plenty of memories of individuals who have been reported in the Police Gazette. And who will go in there? Well, it will be the deserters, not the pensioners. Which takes us into the deserters from the armed forces. Sir John Fielding's new plan of 1761 to 63 included that recommendation that the Secretary of War transmit to the Centre Office at Bow Street the names and descriptions of all deserters. This part of the plan was adopted by the War Office, and they paid Sir John Fielding £20 a year towards keeping records at Bow Street. We can imagine that in Bow Street there were maybe books or lists kept of all the deserters with the descriptions as notified by the War Office. And potentially they may have got dated back to the 1760s. Deserters feature in pretty much all gazettes I've seen. And we see mainly, we start off with Army, we get Admiralty, we'll see Militia and Royal Marines, and finally we'll see the Air Force. So ultimately all areas of the forces potentially get a mention. Here's an example of a page from the Police Gazette from 2nd of March 1868, and it is one of many that lists hundreds, thousands, if we were to add them all up, hundreds of thousands of deserters. There's a couple of examples here that I've just taken from the top of that Gazette. We have John McKenna. They're actually printed the other way around, so it's McKenna John. You get the regiment number, the corps, so he was in the 85th Foot, where he was born in Ressery and Fermanagh. He was by trade a tailor. We have his age, 23 and a quarter, so he's born in the 1840s. What's size, which is height, 5'5.5", dark brown hair, hazel eyes, fresh face, and coat and trousers supposed plain, so what they believe he's wearing or was wearing when he deserted. They'll give the date of desertion, the place of desertion, in this case the Curragh, and marks and remarks, in this case an upper incisor decayed. It's the marks and remarks where you would find lists of tattoos in relation to deserters. Just under John McKenna, or McKenna John, is Alex McDougall. Again, we've got a regimental number. We've got, he's in the 86th Foot. He was born in Dublin. He's a labourer. He's slightly younger than John McKenna. He's 19 and a half. He's about the same height. He's 5'5.25". Brown hair, brown eyes, fresh face. So very similar sort of simple description. In this case, he's got his coat and trousers and they're regimental. So he's gone away in his regimental attire. He deserted 14th of January from Gosport. And he was off furlough to Dublin. Just recapping, in part 2, we've so far covered illustrations in the Police Gazette. That's illustrations primarily of offenders, but also of persons who had gone missing. We've had a look at deserters, of which there are substantial lists with detailed descriptions. And now we're moving on to where you might find original copies of the UK Police Gazette. For despite substantial quantities of the Gazette being printed, and they were circulated to magistrates, to jails, to police stations throughout Great Britain, and most probably Ireland. I've got a number of examples of police gazettes in my collection with an address for Ireland. Overall, very few copies have survived. It is most likely police forces destroyed most of the gazettes they received, and therefore in the rare instances they do survive, they would only really survive if they were bound up into a volume of some kind. Often that would mean just retaining one copy a week, and so during the period 1839 to 84 we have 3 copies being printed, but it's quite likely that only one a week would have been deemed worthy of keeping, and the other 2 would have been destroyed. We need to always bear in mind anyway that the paper quality from the 1840s onwards is noticeably thinner, it's noticeably cheaper, and you've also got some issues around the print quality as well. I can imagine they were easy to tear, and potentially when illustrations began to appear in the Police Gazette, possibly the police station snipped out those pictures and put those up on the notice board to help in identifying potential criminals. Well, if we think about the challenges they present for indexing, there are a few. So OCR isn't as straightforward as maybe a normal newspaper. For some reason it may have been how they were printed, and I can imagine, if you like, a print cylinder of some kind. There's some curvature to the print, certainly in the 1880s, 1870s. So it kind of curves at the top and curves at the bottom. Also, names can be obscured. I mean, that can just be from the print, from print bleeding through from one side to another, or from the police gazettes were working documents, so they often get inked over. So they need careful review and careful indexing. Finally, just thinking about the original copies, it's possible, I talked about the police stations destroying their copies, but it's quite possible they only were required to retain 10 years. And this again may explain why, over time, very, very few of what must have been a huge number of gazettes have actually survived. Now, where that takes us to is there's no complete collection of the UK Police Gazette hue and cry. The earliest ones, say the British Library, has examples 1772 to 1776, I believe, and those have gone online, the British Newspaper Archive. Find My Past. I presume they've come from the British Library or another institutional library. The State Library of New South Wales has 1797 to 1810. So clearly they were being circulated to Australia at some point in time. Then we've got some collections in some record offices. So Somerset Record Office picks up from 1811 to 1827. I think the British Library has a collection after that, and then the Durham Record Office takes us to 1856. So there's a scattered collection of documents, and under here I've just listed the British Library, Yale, National Library of Ireland, the Metropolitan Police Archive and other police archives. These are all places that hold original gazettes, and a large proportion of these were assembled from different collections up to the year 1900 and were microfilmed. I have a personal collection, and I have over 5,000 UK Police Gazette stroke supplements from 1812 to 1935, and I've put those online, and that includes 35-bound volumes covering 39 years. I also have, as I may have mentioned, further gazettes running from 1940s through to 1956, pretty well a complete set from 46 to 56. But none of those include any, I haven't got the deserter sheets that would have accompanied those. But again, a pretty comprehensive collection. That latter part is not online because it's fundamentally too recent. I mentioned in the previous slide there was no complete collection of police gazettes, and that the British Library or a similar institution had enabled the British Newspaper Archive to make available up to 1776. Well, what about the rest of the 1770s to 1790s? Well, the crime was always pretty newsworthy, and it was the driving force really behind the Police Gazette in the first place. And in 1772, one newspaper, it's the only one I'm aware of, the Newcastle Courant, it changed its front page. It added a section entitled General Hue and Cry. And when I first saw an illustration of this, I had a kind of eureka moment. I thought, what's going on here? Fortunately, later, I managed to collect examples of the Newcastle Courant, both leading up to this date and post this date. And so, yeah, they made this switch. And I believe what they printed under that heading is likely to have been reprinted from the Public Hue and Cry, later the Police Gazette. And here is an example. This is the Newcastle Courant, 10th of June 1786. Just make out the title at the top, printed and sold by T. Saint in Pilgrim Street, Newcastle upon Tyne. And we've then got this subtitle, General Hue and Cry. It's basically the section that I've outlined in red. It goes down a little bit further, but it's got lots of notices. And these, I believe, if we had a 1786 Police Gazette, would almost certainly be the source of that notice. What I can add is these appear to be typically notices for offenders. So I'm sorry to disappoint people, there does not appear to be in the Newcastle Courant a list of deserters. This is especially important if we consider between 1776 through to 1790s, there were several wars that Great Britain was involved in, including quite a substantial war in the United States. And there would have been quite a number of deserters, undoubtedly, from the British Army or its other forces, who would have abandoned the British Army and settled. And that would have been a fantastic document to have had, and they may well survive. They may be up in somebody's attic or in somebody's cellar somewhere, and they may yet come to light. An awful lot of this has come to light while I've been collecting. So I certainly don't give up hope, but at the moment it's the Newcastle Courant is one of the main sources. Other papers may have other information, but it's just striking that the Newcastle Courant put in a subheading General Hue and Cry. So what might you find in the Newcastle Courant? Well, next slide is quite a lengthy report, but I hope you find it useful, just to sort of help explain how much might have been published. This is Mary Peake from the Newcastle Courant, 1786. Whereas Mary Peake, single woman, late servant to Henry Jervis of Cheswadine in the county of Shropshire, Esquire, stands committed on a strong suspicion, as well as her own confession, of feloniously stealing out of the dwelling house of the said Henry Jervis divers goods the property of the said Henry Jervis. And whereas the said Mary Peake on Monday the 22nd of May last, about 10 in the evening, made her escape, and is apprehended, is gone off with one Richard Marsh, by trade a peruke maker and hairdresser. The said Mary Peake is a native of Stafford, is rather low in stature, pitted with the smallpox, has dark brown hair, and was dressed, when she went off, in a black bonnet, black stuff gown, a black quilt, white stockings and slippers. The said Henry Marsh, who it's supposed aided and assisted her in her escape, is a rather good-looking man, jolly in the face, about 5 feet 8 inches high, wears his own hair curled. That's a pretty good description, I'm sure you'll agree. I've just been talking about original police gazettes and explained that there's no complete list from 1772. No institution has a complete set of police gazettes from 1772. And therefore it's imperative really to be aware of that and be aware that there may be valid substitutes which can be used certainly for criminal ancestors, if not deserters from the armed forces, filling in some of the critical gaps in the runs that do survive. Now, before we get into what's online, which will undoubtedly be the way that most family historians touch the Police Gazette, I need to make an apology, I suppose. I'm recording this on the 18th of April 2020. Now, one of the problems recording something like this is it'll soon be out of date. We're just going to be having a look at what's currently online at the moment, but it's very likely that more information, more police gazettes, more runs of the police gazettes will be found, and they will go online at some point. So I'm starting with the British Newspaper Archive. This is the source for currently the earliest police gazettes available, and it is really very impressive. They've managed to locate the number they have. I think 1773 they've got examples to 1776. I suspect more will surface and they'll probably appear here in the British Newspaper Archive at some point. There's further copies for 1829, a few for 1856 at the moment, but I would imagine more again will start to fill in these gaps. 1880 appears to be complete currently, as does 1898. Find My Past also has an index, about 80,000 records of individuals who appeared from 1797 to 1810, and a further index for deserters and absentees covering World War I. The British Newspaper Archive also has the Newcastle Courant from 1772 to 1799, and I estimate, and I may be slightly out here, that it's pretty well 100% coverage, 93% or thereabouts coverage during that time period, which is remarkable. So this is certainly an area a website you would definitely investigate for searching the Police Gazette. I've just talked about what's available on the British Newspaper Archive, with, I should add in brackets, heavy qualifications. I'm sure more will appear in terms of the Police Gazette, especially when we look at how the actual site has developed over time and the number of titles, the depth of titles, the years covered of newspapers. has grown exponentially, really. I'm very certain at some stage that the Police Gazette again will expand pretty dramatically on that site. Ancestry also has a good collection of UK Police Gazettes, and I just want to talk briefly about my own site, Last Chance to Read. I have now just over 5,000 issues, that's Police Gazettes and supplements, from the early 1800s up to 1935, all online and searchable. That's about 32,000 pages, and that includes basically the full years, or maybe one issue might be missing, between 1884 and 1913. So it's a pretty comprehensive collection, really. And you're welcome to search at lastchancetoread.com. And if you have any problems and you're looking for somebody but you can't find them, or you want a bit more detail, you're welcome to send a message, and I'm more than happy to have a look, and I will message you back as soon as I can. What I do need to say, and this isn't so much an apology, but it's just how it is. Unfortunately, I can't actually offer them free, so I do need to charge for them. And you can download either a page or you download an entire Gazette, and via payment via PayPal. But hopefully it'll be of interest. So there's an awful lot of names and an awful lot of people's ancestors in there. So what we've actually got at Last Chance to Read, the bulk of I've listed them all down here, but the bulk of the collection starts really from the 1860s, so in that 1840 to 1883 period, and ends in 1913. So it's very good coverage throughout that mid-Victorian period, right the way through to pre-World War One. And then there's a bit further coverage in the 1920s. After that and before that, there's just a few issues. So if your ancestor, and we'll touch on this, if your ancestor, you're expecting them to appear in the Police Gazette because of other documents you have or other records you've got, and they are pre those dates or potentially post those dates, then at the moment, I'm afraid it's not surprising if you don't find them on this site. I hope that helps. So I've talked a fair bit about the UK Police Gazette. Hopefully you can see that it's potentially a really useful source for researching your criminal ancestors and other ancestors, but particularly your criminal and possibly your armed forces ancestors. So you have a known criminal ancestor from other documents you have, and you go and have a look online. You don't find them. Why isn't my criminal ancestor in the UK Police Gazette? Well, firstly, and most obviously, I suppose, the notices in the Police Gazette were for individuals who were wanted for a crime. Now, if your ancestor was arrested quickly, there's obviously no need to submit a notice to the Gazette. Less obviously, not all police forces are equal in here, so not all police forces consistently publish notices in the Police Gazette, despite being in quite large towns or cities, which you might expect to have levels of crime and levels of unsolved crime, which might attract a notice in the Police Gazette. Liverpool seems to be quite underrepresented. Other locations in Lancashire, by comparison, seem to have quite a few notices for them. The Gazette which mentioned your ancestor, so another reason, isn't currently online, and so that sort of reflects back to the information I showed you on Last Chance to Read. Finally, but this doesn't cover every possible option, but finally, your ancestor actually is in the Police Gazette, but you just can't find them. So their name is spelled incorrectly, they used an alias. We've seen plenty of examples of those. The forename was shortened, and you're looking for the usual name. So WM for William, Jazz for James, THOS for Thomas, JNO for John. Behind the scenes, it could equally be there's software that's indexing the Gazette and it's made a mistake. So, for example, if we were looking to newspapers, we would find capital W can, I won't say necessarily be frequent, but it's more than occasionally appears as two V's, and so you'll be looking for Ilium rather than William or Williams. Equally, you may be searching for John McKenna, and possibly the site has got it down as McKenna John, and you need to search as McKenna John. And just as a reminder, again, if you do search Last Chance to Read, fail to find somebody you expected, either a criminal ancestor or a deserter, and I know how difficult it can be, just drop a message and all the details you've got, including name, roughly date of birth, place of birth if you've got any idea, or any other details you've got, and I'm happy to quickly take a look for you and get back to you. So that ends my coverage of the UK Police Gazette. We've now got a couple of slides really on the Police Gazette Ireland. I say publication, so I believe this started 1825, maybe a little bit before. It's a bit unclear. There's a couple of examples here from my own collection, just the front pages, and you can see it says Police Gazette, and under that it says Hue and Cry. Just going to talk a little bit about original copies of the Police Gazette or Hue and Cry for Ireland. They were all printed, incidentally, all the ones I have anyway, in Dublin. In the National Archive in Dublin, there is some correspondence from 1822 relating to the printing of the Police Gazette. I haven't seen it. I'm just relying upon the catalogue description. It seems likely that would relate to the Irish Police Gazette. There is some earlier details in there, but I think they may relate to the Police Gazette published in the UK. So potentially it may have been earlier than 1825. The reason I'm calling out 1825 is in Critchard Woods, the Post Office London Directory, and I've got a copy of this from 1825. I've got quite a large directory collection. They list newspapers, including newspapers published in Ireland, and that lists a publication called the Dublin Hue and Cry, published every Saturday. I suspect, I can't prove it, but that may well be the Police Gazette Hue and Cry, Dublin. The odd thing though is, I would have thought advertisements that appear in the Post Office London Directory would be connected commercially. So they would be the kind of newspapers you could advertise in. And so I'm a little bit puzzled whether or not you'd be actually able to advertise in the Police Gazette Hue and Cry at that date for Ireland. Certainly in the copies I have, which we'll come to briefly in next slide, there was no opportunity to advertise. It was a free newspaper. Between 1839 and 1873, I found 33 issues scattered in archives and libraries in the UK, Ireland and the USA. So this appears to be quite a scarce publication. But what I would say is I've been collecting newspapers for 20 years, and I'm always finding things that are rare or obscure, or things that people wouldn't have known existed. And it's a matter of patience and a matter of just persistence. And things do turn up. I'm therefore convinced that there will be, in the same way for the UK Police Gazette, I'm convinced there are other collections yet to be catalogued There will be other gazettes in archives, and other gazettes that are sitting in people's attics, in people's cellars, dropped down behind. Some of mine have come from old police stations, behind old radiators and things. So there will be other gazettes that will come to light, and I'm absolutely convinced that may be a view for today, but I've no doubt more will be there. I would expect more information to come out from the National Library of Ireland and the National Archive in Dublin. I've got 1070 police gazettes published in Dublin, and they stretch from 1863 to 1898. I've also given you a breakdown of the coverage, just to sort of demonstrate that some years I've got really good coverage, other years I've got next to nothing. So you've just got to be aware of that. And these are all on lastchancetoread.com, but it's what I have at the moment. I'm always hoping to find more, and if I do, and I can afford to acquire them and add them and scan them, then I will do so. That's just how it works. But yeah, you've got to, just to give you a fairly good idea of what I've got anyway. So it's gets pretty good in the 1880s, starts to tail off by the 1890s, but yeah, it's pretty good coverage in certain years. Just want to talk about just briefly police gazettes beyond the seas. So I'm not going to go into any great depth on this. This is really wrapping up this talk. Here's an example again from my own collection. This is New South Wales Police Gazette, 19th of February 1879. I say from my accumulation, it's probably more appropriate than collection. And here we've got Edward Kelly, Daniel Kelly, Stephen Hart and Joseph Burns being proclaimed outlaws in the colony of Victoria, and warrants have been issued and so on and so forth for the willful murder of Michael Scanlon. And these just one example from my Australian collection. These incidentally are not online at the moment. The reason I've not put my Australian collection online is it's relatively small, and anyway there's a lot of other folks who've done a far better job. If we have a look, typically this collection from Find My Past, which is excellent, we've got Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania. Coverage up to 1900. I've mentioned the British Newspaper Archive and Find My Past. And now I just want to mention Ancestry. If I've read the catalogue correctly, then Ancestry has a really comprehensive collection of Australian and New Zealand police gazettes, with many areas running right the way up to 1945, and in the instance of South Australia as far as 1947. Ancestry also has a good collection for Great Britain and Ireland. So when searching the police gazettes, I would recommend that you search the British Newspaper Archive, Find My Past, Ancestry, and if you've time, you're welcome to have a look at Last Chance to Read as well. So that covers all the police gazettes that I've got examples of and can talk from personal experience about. We now come on to the legendary police gazette, I would say. The use of the word legendary in relation to newspapers probably feels to other family historians a bit of an exaggeration. The reason I use it, or when I use it, is if through evidence or the absence of evidence, I become aware that there's a document that has been missed somewhere in the record, and that document could be useful for family historians. I give it this description of legendary. That is until I locate a copy. In relation to the Irish Police Gazette, Police Gazette for Ireland, that was very much, for me, the position I was in for quite a number of years. What I was aware was, when having read thousands and thousands of copies of the UK or Great British Police Gazette, that there were no mentions in there of crimes in Ireland, which struck me as being really unusual. I could find them for England, Scotland and Wales, but nothing for Ireland. That, if nothing else, convinced me there must be an equivalent version that I hadn't come across, hadn't seen a copy of for Ireland, and I searched for many years. Finally, one copy surfaced and another damaged copy, and then that set me off on the hunt to see if I could locate and see more and see how similar and different they were from the UK Police Gazettes. So for me, the Police Gazettes for Ireland, even though they appear to be very incomplete at the moment, are no longer legendary. India Police Gazettes, on the other hand, for me, certainly are legendary. I've only got 3 references, and I'd appreciate anything else that anybody else may unearth. So in 1858, in the Indian News and Chronicle, there's a report that the Police Gazette is to be re-established, which in itself is interesting. It was to be printed in Agra, and the police will communicate particulars of aggravated crimes, the names of offenders, with a certain amount of the rewards for apprehension. And that sounds very, very similar to the police gazettes we would see for the UK, for Ireland, and which are probably quite familiar. In 1877, we move on to a report that certain convictions by criminal courts in the Punjab, this is actually from the Punjab record, of persons not being native Indian subjects to be published in the Police Gazette. What I don't know is whether there was one unified Police Gazette for India, or whether there were separate Police Gazettes for different areas of India. And then, maybe not surprisingly, and this may explain why the Police Gazette for India isn't that well known, or copies aren't easily to be found in catalogues. In 1904, again in the Punjab record, such books as have become obsolete may be destroyed, and bound volumes of the Police Gazette may, after 15 years, also be destroyed. Now, in the UK, there appears to be, I haven't put the evidence in this talk, police stations might be required to retain copies of the Police Gazette, and there may be an inspection. Certainly that appears to have been the case post World War II, and I suspect prior to that as well. So you may be running in a small police station, you get the Police Gazette every week, you keep copies, maybe not every single copy, but you bind them up and you keep a record. And that was somebody's job, somebody's duty. It looks as if a similar sort of process was running, or procedure was running in India, or may have done. And equally, at some point, it's clear that those gazettes are no longer seen to be of value, not for the job they were intended, which is tracking, identifying offenders, and they would be destroyed. And it seems a very similar pattern in India. So that's the legendary. We're ending on not necessarily on a high, but on something I can't show you an example of because I can't find an example in any catalogue at the moment. Well, that's it. We've covered what the Police Gazette is. We've covered the origins of it. We've gone through to have a look at what you might find in it in terms of if you've got criminal ancestors, possibly ancestors from the armed forces. We've had a look at where the gaps might be, and we've had a look at the other police gazettes that existed around the world, ending on a police gazette I can't even show you, but I do believe exists for India. I hope some of this has been interesting and you haven't come across it all before, and therefore you've learnt something that may be useful, if not now, at some point when you're trying to trace your ancestors. Thank you again for listening. Goodbye.